You know, I've got to admit, I feel like at some point in my life, Ford Heights, Illinois is no longer going to exist. For this video, I'll be showing you all there is to see in Ford Heights these days, which isn't much. The suburb is about 25 miles south from downtown Chicago. It's actually closer to Gary, Indiana, as Gary is only 15 miles to the northeast. But yeah, Ford Heights. The place is kind of dreary, kind of depressing, hopeless, the blight seems endless, and at times, the village leadership over the years has been a circus. I'll start out the video by telling you what the place is like today, before talking about the story of Ford Heights and how it became to be the way that it is today. You know you've entered Ford Heights when you see this sign here. But wait, that needs updated. Yeah, that's more accurate. You also know you've entered Ford Heights when you start seeing abandoned subsidized housing. It's sad. More of those later in the video. Another thing you'll notice when entering town from the east is the most profitable business in town, that being the Atlantis Gentlemen's Club. Outside of it, there's only 4 businesses in town, including a dollar store, a fish and chicken restaurant, a gas station, and a liquor store, all along Lincoln Highway. Ford Heights was once home to over 5,000 people, but that was back in 1980. Based off of the history of the place, it's safe to assume that the population growth early on was due to Ford Heights historically being a haven for public housing. That's right, Ford Heights was never a wealthy city. You're not going to find old, historic, crumbling mansions in town like you would maybe in Gary or Detroit. Anyway, these days it seems as if there's more abandoned, subsidized housing units in town than there are ones that are still active. I say all of that, of course, while we're passing by an abandoned school. More on the Ford Heights School District in a few minutes. Ford Heights is easily the most lousy municipality among a collection of other crumbling southern Cook County suburbs. Other places nearby, like Chicago Heights and Sauk Village, share a lot of similarities with Ford Heights, although not quite to the same extreme as what you'll see here. Additionally, Ford Heights is a part of what is called the Calumet region, which covers the Calumet River watershed and spreads throughout southern Cook County and northwest Indiana. So, just how bad are things in Ford Heights exactly? Some sources on the web say that Ford Heights' unemployment rate is as high as 43%. Other sources say 14%, and some even go as low as 8%. Whether it's 8%, whether it's 14% or 40%, I'm not sure, but I am sure that the national unemployment rate as of January 2024 is 3.7%, so even if Ford Heights' unemployment rate is 8%, that's still more than twice the national average rate. I have a feeling that the unemployment rate is a little bit higher than 8%, however, and you might too as we continue on with the video. Meanwhile, we are now in the projects. Yo.
Nope.
Okay, well, this is Very Yates. It's the last remaining Section 8 neighborhood in Ford Heights. Some of the units have been boarded up, so it makes you wonder how much longer this community will continue to exist. I want to get back to the population loss that has occurred here. So, the official peak population count for Ford Heights was once again in 1980 at 5,347. That's not that big of a number, but it's not super tiny either. That being said, the city lost 20.3% of people the following decade, followed by a loss of 18.3% by 2000, followed by a loss of 20.1% by 2010, and a loss of 34.4% by 2020. Now, is there any reason to believe that this trend will change? I mean, there's no way that it does, right? At this rate, I would be shocked if anyone still lived here in 30 years. Seriously, I feel like if you're driving by on Lincoln Highway in the year 2050, you'll see barricades up in the form of tree stumps or concrete barriers. I believe all of the buildings will be torn down at that point, and the land will return back to nature. I mean, let's be honest. Mostly everyone who has been able to leave Ford Heights at this point has likely already left. Also, how many more $16.7 million improvements is Cook County going to invest into the Very Yates projects? A renovation was just completed in 2021, so in 20 to 30 years, there's going to be another need for a multi-million-dollar renovation, and it will cost a lot more than $16.7 million. Basically, what I'm saying is that it would be cheaper to raise the complex here or just let it sit here abandoned, I guess, like they have some other public housing units, than it would be to renovate it, and it would be cheaper to build a new one elsewhere. So that's probably what's going to happen the next time that a huge renovation is needed for the Vera Yates projects. Well, now let's transition to talking about the school district here. Because amazingly so, as of this day in February of 2024, when I'm editing this video, there are still 2 schools within the still active Ford Heights School District 169. Those schools being an elementary school and a middle school. High schoolers in town attend Bloom Trail High School, which is a mile south of Ford Heights along Cottage Grove Avenue. Apparently there's around 450 students within the school district today, but with the continued decline in population with the city of Ford Heights, I don't know how the school district is going to be able to survive much longer. Because if you think about it, how on earth can you justify keeping a school district with 2 schools when you're surrounded by other larger school districts that can most likely handle the capacity of Ford Heights students being added to their schools? How is the Ford Heights School District supposed to stay afloat when it's being funded by a community that, before you know it, will eventually be home to less than 1,000 people? Apparently, the school district is funded 50.6% by local sources, 40.3% from state sources, and 9% from federal sources. Eventually, though, I believe that there's going to be a breaking point, and the district will then be forced to close. Now, onto the economic stats for Ford Heights. Around 1,600 people call Ford Heights home today. That's according to the latest official population estimates. The median household income is $37,800, and only 12% of adults 25 and older hold a bachelor's degree or higher. The median value of owner-occupied housing units is $42,200, which is around the same price of a new car, which of course is a depreciating asset. Lastly, the poverty rate is 37.6%. In other words, Ford Heights is on its own economic poverty-stricken island on the edge of Cook County. I mean, the town does receive some economic support from Cook County, but because of the shrinking population, those dollars are coming in much lower amounts than what this community needs to be able to improve its overall structure. And that just backs up my theory that one day, sooner rather than later, Ford Heights is going to disappear off of the map. Speaking of disappearing off of the map, some of the streets already have. Some streets have been covered up with thick vegetation. Other streets, you wouldn't be able to tell at all that a city street was once there. Here's a satellite photo from 1938 showing the original town of what was to become Ford Heights, Illinois. Here you can see a clean layout of grid streets. Now we'll transition to a satellite photo of today's Ford Heights, and here's all of the stretches of street that are missing from the original grid. Today, however, the original center part of the town is completely empty, and you can see a wave of housing additions that were built in the 1960s to the east, south, and west of what was the original town. While many of the original streets in the center part of town have completely disappeared, others have only partially disappeared, like the 2 that I'm passing by on the left. The first street that we're passing is Cannons Lane, and the second one is Hammond Lane. This is the spot where a public housing project was only partially completed. It was called Cannons Lane Town Homes, and it was the 4th Section 8 housing complex in town. The aborted Cannons Lane Town Homes, however, gained national attention in 1970 when a murder took place there, which is something that we can talk more about once we get there in the history timeline. So let's begin the history timeline, shall we? The land that we know of today as Ford Heights, Illinois, first saw settlers around 1848, those settlers being onion and fruit farmers. In the later half of the 19th century, the area was a stopping point for the Underground Railroad, which brought in freed slaves from the South. Further along, groups of Polish, Lithuanian, and Italian immigrants came to the southern area of Cook County around the turn of the century. In the early 1920s, a plot of farmland that had a slight rise in elevation over Deer Creek was turned into a residential subdivision called the Park Addition. It really was just in the middle of farmland. Nothing else had developed at this point. Chicago Heights to the west was the closest city. Also, I looked for a long time for a map that labeled this place as Park Addition, but sadly, I couldn't find any. Anyway, the streets for Park Addition were laid out on the north side of what at the time was just a farm road between Chicago Heights and Indiana. That farm road soon became a 2-lane concrete highway that was a part of the Lincoln Highway, or US 30. During that same year in 1924, Park Addition had 40 families that petitioned for electrical service, but they didn't get it until sometime in the 1930s. When that happened, the village incorporated with the name of East Chicago Heights. Now, when the name change from Park Addition to East Chicago Heights occurred is really unknown, as there really isn't much documentation online about the history of this place. To me, that's just further proof that Ford Heights has always been a poverty-stricken community, because think about it, if this place was considered as anything but poverty-stricken, or if it was a place that wasn't just forgotten about and was never paid attention to, wouldn't you think that there would be some historic pictures of this place available somewhere? Well, guess what? There aren't any. None that I could find anyway. It's kind of like a parent who forgot to take pictures of their kid when they were young. But yeah, to me, that just further confirms that this community was always an economically challenged place. So yeah, East Chicago Heights was dealt a bad hand from the start. Not only were they the last municipality in Cook County to receive electricity, but for the early years, it was always a rural village with a high amount of poverty. Another example is that the village didn't get a fire truck until 1948. After that, the place was able to become fully incorporated in 1949. The local government for the community was always unorganized. There was never a strong tax revenue here, only a few commercial businesses ever set up shop along Lincoln Highway. The lack of a strong tax revenue hurt the town's chances to grow in the first half of the 20th century, whereas many of the other municipalities nearby, in the largely blue-collar Calumet region, were growing rapidly due to the rapid industrial growth in the area. So because there was nothing here, and because it was seen as a poverty-stricken rural community, so to speak, people didn't really move to East Chicago Heights to start a family. It was never an attractive place for people to want to relocate to. During the 1940s and 50s, many of the white families that were still in East Chicago Heights up and left, as they had the means to do so. What made the place unattractive to live in for people during that era was probably the lackadaisical city services, the poor fire and poor police response times, poor schools, so pretty much anywhere else nearby was considered to be a better community to live in. By 1950, 76% of the population of East Chicago Heights was black. It became a community that was attractive for other black families that were affected by racist practices around the greater Chicago area that kept their living and work options limited. In 1956, the Ford stamping plant was opened just west of the village limits of East Chicago Heights, so the community wasn't going to be able to collect the tax revenue despite it being located at the corner of Cottage Grove Avenue and Lincoln Highway. Despite the name of the community today, the name change didn't come until later. Originally, the Ford stamping plant was on a plot of unincorporated land. Anyway, the Ford plant was one of the few companies in the area that offered equal salary to employees regardless of their race. So, with there being a strong black population in East Chicago Heights, the population in town grew due to the abundance of good-paying jobs at the Ford plant. As a result, East Chicago Heights saw what was probably the best era in terms of quality of life during the later half of the 1950s. It was the first, and also, very likely, the last time that the community will ever see a taste of middle-class representation among its residents. Earlier I mentioned how there used to be an organized layout of grid streets in the central part of town. Well, there were quite a few older homes along those grid streets. But all of that was cleared out sometime in the late 50s or early 60s. The reason why is because there were 63 acres of land that was deemed to be unlivable, so 60 families were forced to leave their homes. Shortly after, all of the homes on those 63 acres of land were torn down. As a result of that, along with a growing demand for housing, there were several housing additions to the west, east, and south that were built to satisfy the housing demand. I just got done driving through one of those separate housing additions, and as you saw, today every other home is either in poor shape, is blighted, or has returned back to being a vacant lot. During the 1960s, however, is also when the planned public housing projects started to get built for low-income families in East Chicago Heights. So it seems as if the peak years for the town lasted for only a short while. These housing projects brought a couple thousand more people into East Chicago Heights. However, the new residents were all a part of the low-income group. They only moved here because of the new projects being built in town. So that didn't help attract any new commercial businesses, as the new group brought in a huge spike in crime. That's a key part of the whole picture because the town's resources were completely strapped, especially with the large increase of new people. For example, there were a lot of times where the police department was only able to have one officer working during a shift. Eventually, the village of East Chicago Heights ended up falling into debt. And now, we've reached the point on the history timeline where gang activity comes in play. In 1964, the Blackstone Rangers moved into town from Chicago and became the first gang to roam the streets of East Chicago Heights. This gang was in other South Chicago suburbs as well, such as Harvey and Dixmoor. The leader for the pack in East Chicago Heights was Monty Powell. One of the earliest happenings of gang activity in town occurred in 1969 when an East Chicago Heights police officer confiscated a gun from a gang member. Later, Powell then called for 4 gang members alongside himself to rob the East Chicago Heights police station right after midnight. And that was by design because, of course, only one officer ran the shift at night. And with the one officer on duty, he was outnumbered. Powell ended up fatally shooting the police officer, in which then Powell was sent to prison. Next is the murder that caught national attention in 1978. One night, a white couple, Lawrence Leinberg and his fiancée Carol Schmall, were kidnapped from a gas station in the Chicago suburb of Homewood, Illinois. From there, they were taken to the partially completed and abandoned projects along Cannons Lane in East Chicago Heights, which is where both Lawrence and Carol were murdered. 3 black males and 1 black female, who were often referred to as the Ford Heights Four, were charged with the crime initially. Unfortunately, the original 4 who were arrested were manipulated by police officers and prosecutors to lie. Authorities told the 4 that they would get deals if they testified and said what the police officers and prosecutors wanted them to say, and that led to false charges against the Ford Heights Four. In 1996, however, the results of DNA testing found who the real 4 suspects were. One of them died from a drug overdose in 1993. 2 of them pled guilty and are currently serving life sentences, while the 4th suspect is serving a 65-year sentence. However, given the national attention that the 1978 murder in East Chicago Heights saw, it left the town with a negative reputation in the national eye for a long time, which made it even harder for the town to grow a sustainable tax base. The aborted Cannons Lane townhome projects were torn down shortly after the 1978 murder, and the street was removed as well. However, gang activity continued to get worse throughout the 80s and 90s. In the later half of the 80s, gang members started to sell crack on the streets. Gangs would compete for territory, and that would lead to violent shootouts between competing gangs. Most of the gang members lived in the Lena Canada and Selena Blake projects. Lena Canada was at 16th and Berkeley, while Selena Blake was at 15th and Drexel. They were both a short walk from one another. Things were so bad, however, in the 80s that police officers were said to have been scared to pursue criminals who lived in either Lena Canada or Selena Blake, as the criminals probably would have been able to kill an officer and get away with it. Yeah, that was the town's culture at the time. That being said, we're just about at the corner of 16th and Drexel where the Selena Blake projects once stood. Selena Blake was nicknamed the Bronx, while Lena Canada was often referred to as Vietnam, due to the extreme amount of gang violence that took place here. Really quick, as I've mentioned before, how there isn't great documentation on the history of Ford Heights. There's not even a photo anywhere of what the old Lena Canada projects used to look like before they were torn down. Not that I could find anyway. But because the documentation is so hard to find on this area when researching, I've actually found out that there's some confusion between where the Lena Canada homes were and where the Selena Blake homes were. The way that I was able to confirm which project was which was through this website here called Chicago Gang History, where they have several lower quality old photos uploaded to their website, but this one here shows the welcome sign to Lena Canada Homes, and by going back to 2007 on Google Street View, this picture was taken at 16th and Greenwood, which is right here on the map. So, with the only other project south of Lincoln Highway being called Selena Blake, that would mean that the ones that are still standing are what used to be Selena Blake, or the Bronx. And here's what they look like today. Man, how crazy is it that these buildings haven't been torn down yet? Back to some more gang history in a bit, because along the history timeline in the midst of all of this peak gang activity throughout the 80s was the municipality renaming itself from East Chicago Heights to Ford Heights. This was a desperate effort from the community to be able to annex the land that the Ford plant stood on. Along with the extreme gang activity, Ford Heights was deemed as not only the poorest suburb in all of Chicagoland, but also in the nation throughout the 80s. Things were bad here on all levels, so the community really needed to catch a break. Well, at the time, the Ford plant wasn't located in any city. It was on unincorporated land, so neither Chicago Heights or East Chicago Heights owned the Ford plant. Anyway, the city of Chicago Heights ended up making a better deal than Ford Heights did. I mean, Chicago Heights had better resources to negotiate with, so Ford ended up annexing with Chicago Heights rather than Ford Heights. So, unfortunately, the newly named Ford Heights didn't get the break that they were looking for, and Chicago Heights was the city that ended up collecting the tax revenue from the Ford plant. Well, Ford Heights might have changed its name, but the reputation of the town surely didn't. In fact, the gang violence was said to have been even worse. In the 90s, it said that Ford Heights was a lawless town. It was also common to see cars from Indiana lined up in the area of 16th and Berkeley, which is where the Lena Canada homes were, or Vietnam. But people would flock over to that street corner to buy crack and heroin. The town couldn't afford to pay their police officers a decent salary, so police officers then started to take bribes from the gang members. Of course, the other part of the deal was to allow the gangs more freedom to operate lawlessly. Well, 6 out of the 9 Ford Heights police officers were found to have taken bribes. The officers would alert the gang members whenever a raid was coming, and that was on top of allowing them to get away with all of their criminal activity. Additionally, whenever someone who was a part of one of the gangs ended up getting arrested by one of the cops who were doing their jobs, the bad cops would alter the reports so that the gang members could get away with whatever it was that they were doing. Really, it was just a great setup for the gang members. Later on, 4 of those 6 police officers ended up being charged with federal crimes. Well, with the huge presence of the crack epidemic, the corruption, and the overall lawlessness throughout Ford Heights, do you want to know what the result was of that? What do you think all of the law-abiding families did who still resided in Ford Heights? Do you want to know what they did? Yeah, they left, that's right. And do you want to take a wild guess at what that meant for the town? Well, it meant an even more depleted tax base. Starting sometime in the mid to late 90s, however, both the state patrols and the Cook County Sheriff's Office started to take over Ford Heights. They immediately made over 150 drug and weapons arrests through sweeps in the projects. This action greatly reduced the criminal activity, but it didn't solve all of the problems as gang violence continued to persist. In 2008, all of the remaining Ford Heights police officers quit, and the town hasn't had its own police force ever since. Cook County Sheriff's Office currently patrols Ford Heights. Throughout the 2000s, the city saw crime significantly reduce, but blighted buildings became overwhelming. The city tore down several homes, but that just made the place uglier, creating spots for illegal dumping and patches of overgrown weeds. Financially, the city also just couldn't keep up with tearing down all of the blighted properties. Property values declined significantly due to the appearance of the town. The abandoned homes also served as hideouts for crack addicts, so at this point, everything had spiraled out of control for Ford Heights, as the city had absolutely no finances available to fix any of the major problems. In 2001, authorities started to tell the remaining residents inside Selena Blake and Lena Canada that they had to leave. The Lena Canada projects were demolished sometime in 2005, however the Selena Blake buildings are still up, as you just saw, with the last remaining residents moving out of Selena Blake sometime around 2008. Now on to some of the more recent events. There's been a lot of other corruption in this town other than just the police force in the 90s. For example, former Ford Heights Mayor Charles Griffin back in 2018 was accused of stealing nearly $150,000 from the village. Looks like he was in jail, but then released, but he had to wear an ankle bracelet. What does that say about a town when the former mayor has to wear an ankle bracelet? Wow. Well, the most recent form of corruption comes through the news cycles only a few weeks before I'm uploading this video to YouTube. Apparently, Ford Heights has been taxing their residents to help fund a library that doesn't exist. The community hasn't had a standalone library in 30 years. Rather, they have a small room inside of the community center that's dedicated as a library. Yet, public records show that there's been over $100,000 of tax revenue collected over the past decade for an official library. But nobody knows where those funds are actually going to. But everyone's pretty sure that they're not going towards building a new library. Local radio station WBEZ reported that the Fort Heights Public Library District had requested over $800,000 in levies from its residents between 2011 and 2021. Over that time, the Cook County Treasurer had given more than $120,000 to the Fort Heights Public Library District. The news station also reached out to Fort Heights officials asking them where the money was going to, but Fort Heights officials never responded. Lastly, 30 years ago, the district was forced to close the Fort Heights Public Library as the library was unable to keep things up to code. The building no longer stands today either. It was demolished. In 2018, the Illinois General Assembly approved a request for an audit of the Fort Heights Public Library District, but it never happened because the village officials never agreed to it. The reasoning of the village, however, was that the district would have had to have paid for the audit, and the board said that there wasn't enough money to pay for an audit. Additionally, throughout this entire time, Fort Heights residents have not been able to get a membership at a library in a neighboring city because Fort Heights has their own public library district, so they can't go to another one in a nearby city according to state law. What a freaking circus show. Ay, 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 ay. Well, everyone, what did we learn in this video? We learned that you can't always trust the Fort Heights Public Library District, and in the 80s and 90s, you couldn't always trust the Fort Heights Police Department, but you can always trust Chris's livability score. The first category is education. High schoolers who live in Fort Heights attend Bloom Trail High School. Bloom Trail High School ranks towards the bottom of Chicago area high schools. Only 10% of students are proficient in math, 11% in reading, and 13% in science. Education gets a 4 out of 20. Crime is next, and while the crime rate isn't near as bad as it was in Fort Heights during its peak in the 90s, things are still pretty bad here. For a town of now less than 1,700 people, Fort Heights continues to see multiple homicides per year. According to the most recent data, the violent crime rate here is 1,100 for every 100,000 residents. Crime gets a 5 out of 20. The next category is downtown, which there is no downtown Fort Heights, unless you count the liquor store off of Lincoln Highway as being your downtown. Downtown gets a 0 out of 20. Next up is economy, and the economy in Fort Heights is as lousy as it gets. Sure, there are plenty of jobs in the Chicago region, but a part of the economy score is the overall home values and the fiscal health of the town that I'm focusing on. Economy gets a 3 out of 20. Recreational opportunities are far and few in between from Fort Heights, Illinois. There are some wooded preserved areas with hiking trails in the area. Plum Creek Meadow isn't too far east. Brownell Woods is a quick drive north along 394. Lake Michigan is 15 to 20 minutes northeast, but the closest parts to Lake Michigan from Fort Heights would be where all the steel mills are, in Gary, East Chicago, and Whiting. So not the part of Lake Michigan that you want to be swimming or fishing in. Recreation gets a 3 out of 20. Next up is history, and I'm conflicted on what score to give Fort Heights here. It does have some interesting history, but really, if Fort Heights wasn't full of abandoned public housing, and if Fort Heights didn't have the negative reputation that it does from the gang violence, corruption, and crime over the years, there would be nothing interesting about this place. And because there aren't really any historic landmarks in town, I can't say that the history here brings much value. History gets a 4 out of 20, despite the fascinating story behind the town. Next up is amenities, and I don't know, I didn't see any amenities, did you? That gets a 1 out of 20. The last category is cost of living, and that's easy, 20 out of 20 there. But that's not a good thing in the case of Fort Heights. All in all, the Chris livability score for Fort Heights, Illinois is 40 out of 160, putting it in very last place out of all of the cities that I've done this for so far. Final thoughts here, and yeah, This place isn't a place that anyone would have wanted to step foot in 30 years ago. Unless you were getting drugs, of course. I've said it throughout the video and I'll say it again. Because I mean it. And it's mostly because of the extremely poor finances for the village of Fort Heights, whether it's due to a declining tax base or whether it's due to ex-mayors stealing the village's funds, or whether it's due to the village taxing their residents for 30 years for a library that's never going to get built. I really have a hard time believing that this place won't be a ghost town sometime within the next several decades. And I'm not saying that everyone who lives here is a gangbanger. I'm not saying that nobody who grows up here has a chance in life, because there certainly are people who have survived Fort Heights and have gone on to be successful, law-abiding citizens in whatever it is that they choose to do in life. It's just a lot harder for kids who do grow up in Fort Heights to be able to go on and be successful adults. I mean, the data is out there, people. The research has been done. These are facts. People who grow up in poverty-stricken communities like Fort Heights are a lot less likely to obtain a college degree than people who grow up in, say, Naperville. You know, people who grow up in broken households, as in having only a single mom or a single dad, or just kids who go through a divorce. Maybe they don't have any of their parents and they're being raised by their grandparents because maybe their parents are in jail, who knows? But kids who have chaos like that in their lives at a young age have a harder time succeeding in life. Those are proven facts. That's data. But you know what? It's not impossible, and it's obviously not fair, but it is what it is. Bottom line, stay clear from living in places like Fort Heights, people. And if you live in a place like Fort Heights, if I were you, I would do anything that I could to move to a community that could provide you and your family with better resources. Heck, Chicago Heights, to the west, has better resources than Fort Heights does. And Chicago Heights has plenty of struggles too. But with that said, I do end the video here. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as doing all of those things helps these videos destroy the evil monster that is the YouTube algorithm. Other videos with amazing insights on other places like what you saw here can be found in my Chicago Suburbs playlist, my American Hoods playlist, or in my Illinois playlist. Last but not least, if you can't get enough of me on here, you can always go follow me on my other social media accounts, and those links are below. We'll see you next time. Peace!